Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the small flashlight in her purse. The beam cut through the darkness beyond the vault door, illuminating what looked like filing cabinets lined against the far wall. The air that escaped smelled of old paper and something else, something metallic and cold that made her think of morgues. "Frank, maybe we should call the police?" He stood slowly, his knees protesting 40 years of weekend projects and too much time hunched over security blueprints. "And tell them what? That we found a vault in our legally purchased storage unit?" His eyes, still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, studied the door's mechanism with professional curiosity. "No, Maggie, we need to understand what we're dealing with first." Margaret had met Frank 38 years ago at a faculty mixer where he'd been guest lecturing about bank security to her criminology students. Even then, he'd possessed this careful, methodical way of approaching problems that both frustrated and comforted her. Now, watching him examine the vault like a puzzle to be solved rather than a potential danger, she felt that familiar mixture of admiration and exasperation. The storage facility around them buzzed with the white noise of industrial air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the Central Valley heat. Through the open roll-up door of their unit, Margaret could see other buyers from the estate sale loading their treasures: Depression-era furniture, vintage clothing, boxes of yellowed photographs. Normal things, safe things. She'd convinced Frank to come here on a Tuesday morning because her teacher's pension wasn't stretching as far as they'd hoped. The modest two-bedroom house they'd bought in Bakersfield 5 years ago was supposed to be their reward for decades of public service. His with the bank security firm, hers shaping young minds in Fresno classrooms. But inflation and medical bills had a way of humbling retirement dreams. "Mrs. Rodriguez down the street makes good money selling vintage finds online," she'd told Frank over coffee that morning. "One person's junk, right?" Now, staring into the mouth of this impossible vault, Margaret wondered if some junk was better left buried. Frank disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps echoing strangely in what sounded like a much larger space than should have existed behind a simple storage unit. Margaret followed reluctantly, her flashlight beam dancing across walls that extended far beyond the unit's supposed dimensions. "Jesus Christ," Frank breathed from somewhere ahead. Margaret had taught high school for 32 years, but she'd rarely heard that particular tone of shock in her husband's voice. She quickened her pace, weaving between what appeared to be carefully stacked boxes and something covered in a painter's tarp. Frank stood before an open filing cabinet, a manila folder in his hands. Even in the dim light, Margaret could see documents bearing official-looking letterhead, eagles, and symbols that made her stomach tighten with recognition. German Frank said quietly, "But not just German. Look at this." He held up what appeared to be a passport photo paper-clipped to a typewritten document. The image showed a young man in uniform, his eyes cold and direct. Below the photo, someone had written an American name in pencil, Robert Morrison. "Frank, I don't like this." "Morrison," Frank repeated, ignoring her discomfort. "Where have we heard that name?" Margaret's throat went dry. "The Morrison family runs the hardware store downtown. Tom Morrison's been mayor for 12 years. They stared at each other in the vault's oppressive silence. Margaret's mind, trained by decades of teaching history, began connecting dots she desperately wanted to remain separate. Post-war immigration. Changed names. The careful, precise way elderly Mr. Morrison spoke English, with just the faintest trace of an accent he'd always attributed to childhood speech problems. Frank moved to another cabinet, pulling out more folders. Each contained similar documents: photographs, identity papers, what looked like travel arrangements. Some bore official stamps from organizations Margaret vaguely recognized from her lessons on World War II. "We need to leave," she said suddenly. "We need to put everything back and walk away. Maggie." "No." Her voice carried the authority she'd once used to silence unruly classrooms. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than us. It's dangerous." But Frank had found something else. A leather journal, its pages yellow with age. He opened it carefully, and Margaret caught a glimpse of handwritten entries in English. Names, addresses, some she recognized. The Kaufman family who ran the bakery where she bought Frank's birthday cake each year. The Schneiders who donated money for the new library wing. Dr. Weber, who delivered half the babies in Kern County over the past 4 decades. All of them described in careful detail. All of them refugees from a war that had ended before Margaret was born, carrying secrets that had somehow found their way into Storage Unit 47. Outside, a car door slammed. Footsteps approached across the gravel lot. Margaret grabbed Frank's arm. "Someone's coming." Frank closed the journal with practiced silence and switched off his flashlight. Margaret followed suit, plunging them into absolute darkness. The footsteps outside grew closer. Steady, purposeful, not the casual gait of another bargain hunter, browsing the remaining estate sale offerings. "Mr. and Mrs. Holloway?" a voice called out, pleasant but carrying an edge that made Margaret's skin prickle. "I saw your car in the lot. Everything all right in there?" Margaret's heart hammered as she recognized the voice. Tom Morrison, the mayor whose photograph they'd just discovered in a Nazi document, now standing 20 feet away asking about their welfare with the same neighborly concern he'd shown at countless city council meetings and church potlucks. Frank's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers squeezing once, their old signal for stay quiet. She could hear him breathing carefully through his nose, using the controlled rhythm she'd watched him practice during his mild anxiety attacks about retirement finances. "Just taking our time looking things over," Frank called back, his voice remarkably steady. "You know how it is, trying to decide what's worth hauling home." Morrison's laugh carried easily through the thin storage unit walls. "Oh, I certainly do. My wife sent me back to see if anyone found that antique sewing machine she thought she spotted this morning. Emma's been quilting for 40 years, and she's convinced it's the same model her grandmother used back in Germany." Germany. The word hung in the stifling air like smoke. Margaret pressed herself against the filing cabinet, feeling the cool metal through her cotton blouse. This was Tom Morrison, the man who'd coached Little League for 2 decades, who'd organized food drives during the recession, who sent handwritten thank you notes to teachers during Appreciation Week. She'd voted for him in 3 elections. Frank had served on his Small Business Development Committee. But 30 minutes ago, she hadn't known about the vault, about the documents, about the photograph of a young man in uniform whose eyes held secrets she was beginning to understand. They'd stumbled into by accident. "Haven't seen a sewing machine," Frank replied. "Mostly furniture and old books in this one. Well, if you do spot it, would you mind giving us a holler? We're the blue pickup parked by the office." "Of course." The footsteps retreated, but Margaret didn't dare move until she heard a truck door slam and an engine start. Even then, she waited until the sound faded completely before whispering, "We have to go. Now." Frank switched his flashlight back on, keeping the beam low. "Maggie, look at this." He'd opened the journal again and was pointing to an entry dated 3 months ago. "This isn't old. Someone's been updating these records." She read over his shoulder, her reading glasses sliding down her nose in the humid air. The handwriting was different, more modern, written in blue ballpoint rather than fountain pen ink. It detailed the Schneider family's recent donation to the library, noting their continued community integration and public reputation maintenance. "They're being watched," Margaret said, "or protected, or both." Frank flipped through more pages, and Margaret saw entry after entry documenting the lives of people she knew. The Webers' medical practice, the Kaufman's expansion to a second bakery location, the Zimmerman's grandson's acceptance to Stanford. All of it recorded with clinical precision, as if someone was maintaining files on old friends, or old conspirators. "We have to put everything back exactly as we found it," Margaret said, though her historian's mind was already cataloging details, cross-referencing names and dates the way she'd taught her students to analyze primary sources. "Whatever this is, we're not equipped to handle it." But even as she spoke, she was thinking about her retirement account's disappointing balance, about the prescription costs that seemed to increase every month, about the part-time job at the library she'd been considering just to make ends meet. She was thinking about Frank's restless nights since leaving the security firm, how he'd struggled to find purpose in crossword puzzles and home improvement projects after 40 years of protecting other people's valuables. She was thinking about how ordinary their lives had become, how predictable their routines were. Tuesday grocery shopping at the Kaufman Bakery, Saturday mornings at Morrison's hardware store, monthly dinners at the German restaurant where the elderly staff had always seemed grateful for their patronage, almost protective of their regular customers' privacy. Frank carefully replaced the documents in their folders, but Margaret noticed he held onto the journal a moment longer than necessary. In that pause, she recognized something she hadn't seen in her husband's face since his retirement, the sharp focus of a man who'd found a problem worth solving. "Frank," she said quietly. "I know." He placed the journal back in the filing cabinet. "We'll lock it up, walk away, pretend we found nothing but moldy furniture." But as they prepared to seal the vault door, Margaret caught herself wondering whether their ordinary world, their safe, predictable retirement in a community where neighbors looked after each other, had been an illusion all along. The vault door sealed with a heavy metallic thud that seemed to echo through Margaret's chest. Frank spun the combination lock with mechanical precision, his security training evident in the way he deliberately scrambled the numbers. But as they stood in the dusty storage unit, surrounded by innocuous furniture and boxes of vintage dishes, Margaret felt as though they'd just buried something that refused to stay dead. "We should go home," she said, watching Frank test the lock one final time. "Make dinner, watch the news, pretend this never happened." Frank nodded, but his movements were distracted as he helped her lower the heavy tarp back over the vault door. His hands, usually so steady when working on household repairs, trembled slightly as they smoothed the fabric into place. Margaret recognized the signs, the same restless energy that had kept him pacing their living room for months after his retirement, the same frustrated intelligence that crossword puzzles and weekend projects had failed to satisfy. They drove home in silence through streets that suddenly felt different. The familiar landmarks of their retirement haven, the tree-lined boulevards, the well-maintained parks, the prosperous downtown district where friendly shop owners knew their names, now carried questions Margaret wasn't sure she wanted answered. When they passed Morrison's hardware, she found herself studying the American flag hanging proudly above the entrance, wondering about the man who'd raised it there each morning for 12 years. Their modest ranch house felt smaller when they walked through the front door, as though the weight of what they'd discovered had followed them home. Margaret moved through the motions of preparing dinner, chicken and vegetables, the same Tuesday routine she'd followed for months, while Frank sat at the kitchen table pretending to read the newspaper. But she caught him glancing repeatedly at their landline phone, mounted on the wall beside outdated takeout menus and her grocery list. "Who would you even call?" she asked, setting his plate down with more force than necessary. Frank looked up, surprised by her directness. "I don't know. FBI, maybe? There are protocols for this kind of discovery." "Protocols for what, exactly?" Margaret sat across from him, her own dinner untouched. "For finding documents that might implicate half our neighbors in something that happened before we were born? For destroying the lives of people who've spent 70 years being model citizens? For finding evidence of war crimes, Maggie." The words hung between them like an accusation. Margaret pushed green beans around her plate, thinking about Dr. Weber's gentle hands delivering her niece's premature twins, about the Kaufmans staying open late when she desperately needed a birthday cake for Frank's 68th, about Tom Morrison organizing the search party when old Mrs. Chen had wandered away from the assisted living facility last winter. "Evidence," she repeated, "of crimes committed by 20-year-old boys who are now 90-year-old grandfathers. Men who've paid taxes and coached soccer and donated to charity for longer than some countries have existed." Frank's fork clinked against his plate. "You're talking like a teacher, not a historian. You know better than anyone that age doesn't erase responsibility." He was right, and Margaret hated him for it. She'd spent 3 decades teaching students about justice, about moral courage, about the importance of confronting uncomfortable truths. She'd assigned essays about ordinary citizens who'd remained silent during atrocities, had graded papers condemning the bystanders who'd chosen comfort over conscience. But those had been other people's choices, other people's consequences. Safe moral decisions made in classroom discussions, not in storage units filled with secrets that could destroy her community. The phone rang. They both stared at it, as though the simple sound carried supernatural significance. Margaret's stomach clenched as she recognized the caller ID number, the town hall's main line. "Let it go to voicemail," Frank said quietly. But Margaret was already reaching for the receiver, driven by a lifetime of politeness and civic responsibility that felt suddenly dangerous. "Hello? Margaret? It's Tom Morrison. I hope I'm not calling during dinner." His voice carried the same warm familiarity she'd known for years, but now she heard something else. A careful precision in his pronunciation, the faint accent he'd always blamed on childhood speech problems. "Not at all, Tom. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to follow up about this afternoon. Emma and I were thinking, you and Frank have such a good eye for antiques. If you'd like some help evaluating what you found in that storage unit, we'd be happy to take a look. Sometimes these estate sales hide real treasures, and we'd hate to see you undersell something valuable." Margaret met Frank's eyes across the kitchen table. He was shaking his head slowly, but she could see the same terrible curiosity in his expression that she felt building in her chest. "That's very generous," she heard herself saying. "We're still sorting through everything, but I'll certainly keep that in mind." "Wonderful. Oh, and Margaret, if you happen to find any old papers, immigration documents, family records, that sort of thing, you might want to handle them carefully. Sometimes families are grateful to have those memories returned, if you know what I mean." The line went dead. Margaret set the receiver back in its cradle with hands that no longer felt steady. Outside their kitchen window, the suburban evening continued its predictable rhythm. Neighbors walking dogs, children riding bicycles, the comforting sounds of ordinary life. But something fundamental had shifted, and Margaret realized they'd reached a point where walking away was no longer possible. The call to adventure hadn't been the discovery of the vault. It had been this moment, this choice between the safety of ignorance and the terrible responsibility of truth. Margaret stared at the silent phone as though it might ring again and offer her a different conversation, one that didn't carry veiled threats wrapped in neighborly concern. The kitchen felt too warm despite the air conditioning, and she found herself studying Frank's face, searching for some sign that he understood the magnitude of what they'd stumbled into. "He knows," Frank said quietly, confirming her fears. "The timing of that call, the specific mention of papers, that's not coincidence. Maybe we're overreacting." Margaret's voice sounded thin even to her own ears. "Maybe Tom really is just being helpful. He's always been kind to us." But even as she spoke, she was remembering the careful way Morrison had approached the storage unit that afternoon, how his footsteps had sounded deliberate rather than casual, how quickly he'd appeared after they'd entered the vault, as though he'd been watching. Frank pushed his dinner plate away, the food barely touched. "Maggie, in 40 years of security work, I learned to recognize when someone's fishing for information. That wasn't a friendly offer to help with antiques." The weight of their situation settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. They were 68 and 71 years old, living on fixed incomes in a small community where everyone knew their routines. Their biggest adventures in recent years had been deciding between generic and name-brand groceries, not uncovering conspiracies that could endanger their lives. "What if we're wrong?" she asked, grasping for any possibility that would let them return to their quiet retirement. "What if those documents are fake, or planted, or we misunderstood what we saw?" Frank's expression told her he'd already considered these same desperate alternatives. The vault itself is real. That's 1940s construction, bank-grade security. Someone spent serious money and effort to build that space. And the documents— He paused, running his hands through his thinning gray hair. "The paper quality, the typeface, the aging, my gut says they're authentic." Margaret thought about the journal's recent entries, the clinical documentation of their neighbors' lives. Someone was still actively maintaining those records, still watching the people they'd identified. The realization made her skin crawl. "Even if we wanted to report this, who would believe us?" she said, voicing another fear that had been building since they'd left the storage facility. A retired teacher and a former security guard claiming they found Nazi documents in a storage unit? It sounds like something from a conspiracy theory website. Frank stood and began pacing their small kitchen. the same restless movement that had driven Margaret to distraction during his first months of retirement. But now she understood it differently. This was how her husband processed problems, how his analytical mind worked through complex scenarios. The FBI would investigate, he said. They'd have to, especially if we had physical evidence. Evidence we'd have to steal from a locked vault that we have no legal right to access. Margaret felt the teacher in her emerging, the part that had always insisted students think through the consequences of their actions. We bought a storage unit, Frank, not the right to break into sealed vaults and remove historical documents. We could face criminal charges ourselves. The practical obstacles were overwhelming. They didn't have the combination to the vault. Frank had only managed to crack it once, and he wasn't certain he could repeat the process. Even if they could access the documents again, removing them would constitute theft. And Tom Morrison's phone call suggested they were already being watched, their movements monitored by people who had successfully hidden secrets for 7 decades. Margaret walked to their kitchen window, looking out at the neighborhood they'd called home for 15 years. The Hendersons were barbecuing on their back patio, smoke rising from their grill into the evening air. Mrs. Chen's caregiver was helping her tend to her rose garden. Everything looked normal, peaceful, the way retirement was supposed to be. But now she saw it differently. How many of these quiet homes held secrets? How many of her neighbors carried histories they'd never shared? How many times had she sat in city council meetings, voted in local elections, participated in community events, while surrounded by people living under assumed identities? I keep thinking about our finances, she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. About how we were excited to find anything worth $20 or $30 at that estate sale. And now we're sitting on information that could be worth what? Frank stopped pacing. Money? There's no reward program for 70-year-old Nazi hunting. I don't mean money. Margaret turned from the window, meeting her husband's eyes. I mean purpose, meaning. How long since either of us felt like we were doing something important? The question hung between them, touching on frustrations they'd barely acknowledged, the emptiness of retirement, the sense that their most significant contributions were behind them, the way each day blended into the next without consequence or urgency. Frank sat back down, reaching across the table to take her hand. Whatever we decide together. But Maggie, once we make this choice, there's no going back to who we were yesterday. Margaret looked down at their joined hands, wrinkled, liver-spotted, trembling slightly with age and adrenaline. These weren't the hands of heroes or adventurers. They were the hands of people who clipped coupons, who called their doctor when their backs ached, who had spent the last 3 years learning to live smaller, quieter lives. But they were also the hands that had opened the vault. You're right, she said, her voice steadying with each word. We can't go back, and maybe we shouldn't. Frank's grip tightened. Maggie? No, listen. She pulled her hands free and stood, energy coursing through her in a way she hadn't felt since her last day in the classroom. I spent 30 years teaching students about moral courage, about people who saw injustice and chose to act, even when it was dangerous, even when it cost them everything. She began pacing now, her mind racing with possibilities and plans. How can I face myself in the mirror if I walk away from this? Because you're 78 years old and this isn't a history lesson, Frank said, but his protest lacked conviction. She could see it in his eyes, the same awakening sense of purpose that was building in her chest. Exactly. I'm 78 years old. What are they going to do to me? What's the worst that can happen? Margaret felt almost giddy with the realization. We're not 20-year-olds with careers to protect or children to raise. We're not even particularly healthy. My knees ache every morning and your blood pressure medication costs more than our cable bill. She moved to their kitchen junk drawer, pulling out the small notebook where she kept grocery lists and doctor's appointments. Her teacher's handwriting was still precise as she began writing names, dates, addresses, everything she could remember from the vault. We have nothing left to lose, Frank. Nothing except our consciences. Frank watched her writing with growing alarm. What are you doing? What I should have done in that storage unit, what I trained myself to do for 3 decades. She looked up from the notebook, her eyes bright with determination. I'm documenting evidence, creating a record. Even if something happens to us, even if those documents disappear, someone will know what we found. Maggie, you're talking about going to war with people who've successfully hidden for 70 years, people who clearly have resources, connections, people who are 90 years old. She set down her pen, meeting his gaze directly. Frank, they're dying. Natural causes are going to solve this problem in the next decade, whether we act or not. But their secrets will die with them, and the families who never learned what happened to their murdered relatives will never have answers. The weight of that truth settled between them. Margaret thought about the photographs she'd glimpsed in the vault, faces of people whose names were recorded in those meticulous files, whose fates had been decided by men who'd then spent 70 years coaching Little League and volunteering at church. I need to go back, she said, surprised by her own certainty. We need to go back. Tonight, before anyone realizes what we found. Frank's security training warred with his protective instincts. It's too dangerous. Morrison knows we found something. Morrison suspects. But he can't be certain what we saw or how much we understood. If we act quickly before they can remove the evidence or strengthen their security. She moved to their kitchen window, studying the darkening street. Most of these people are our age, Frank. They're not international criminals anymore. They're retired grandfathers who probably take afternoon naps and go to bed by 9 o'clock. And if we're wrong, if there's more to this organization than elderly Nazis? Margaret considered this, her historian's mind evaluating the evidence. The recent journal entries suggested ongoing oversight, but they could indicate anything from an elaborate conspiracy to simple record-keeping by someone's obsessive grandchild. Then we'll learn something important before we're stopped, she said finally. But Frank, what if we're right? What if we're the only people in position to expose this? What if walking away means these secrets die with them, and justice never comes? She returned to the table, taking his hands again. This time, her grip was firm, certain. I spent my entire career teaching students that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences, that history is shaped by individuals who choose to act when action is difficult. Her voice grew stronger. I will not spend whatever years I have left knowing I was a hypocrite, knowing I chose comfort over courage when it finally mattered. Frank stared at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw the exact instant when his resistance crumbled. The security expert in him was cataloging risks and calculating odds, but the man who'd loved her for 45 years recognized the steel in her voice that had once faced down belligerent school boards and hostile parents. Tonight, he said quietly. Before I lose my nerve and remember I'm too old for this. Margaret smiled, feeling more alive than she had since retirement began. But we can't just walk back in there unprepared, Frank continued, his security instincts taking over. If Morrison suspects something, the whole area could be under surveillance. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. The magnitude of what they were attempting suddenly felt real in a way it hadn't moments before. What kind of surveillance? Cameras? People watching? Could be anything. Motion sensors, security patrols, even just someone parked across the street with a phone. Frank moved to their front window, peering through the curtains at their quiet cul-de-sac. We need to assume they know our car, our faces, our normal routines. The familiar neighborhood looked different now. Every parked car a potential threat, every lit window possibly concealing watching eyes. Margaret realized how exposed they'd been that afternoon, how vulnerable they remained in their own home. Then how do we... She stopped mid-sentence as headlights swept across their living room wall. A dark sedan was pulling slowly down their street, moving too deliberately for a resident returning home. Frank tensed beside her. Kill the lights. Margaret flipped the switch, plunging their front room into darkness. They stood motionless behind the curtain, watching the sedan cruise past their house at walking speed. The driver was invisible behind tinted windows, but the car's deliberate pace felt predatory. Could be anyone, Margaret whispered, though she didn't believe it herself. Could be. Frank's voice was grim. But I don't think so. The sedan disappeared around the corner, but neither of them moved from the window. Margaret's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline of their earlier decision mixing with genuine fear. This wasn't a classroom discussion about historical events. This was happening to them right now in the retirement community they'd chosen for its safety and quiet. "We need help," she said, the admission painful for someone who'd prided herself on independence. "We can't do this alone." Frank nodded slowly. "The question is who we can trust. Our neighbors are clearly out of the question. Police. Morrison has connections throughout local government. FBI." He paused, considering. "FBI might be our best bet, but only if we can prove what we found." Margaret thought about her former colleagues, the teachers and administrators she'd worked with for decades. Most were retired now, scattered across the country, living their own quiet post-career lives. None seemed equipped for this kind of situation. Then she remembered Sarah Chen. What about Sarah? Margaret turned from the window, moving carefully through their darkened living room. "Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, the one who works for that newspaper in Los Angeles?" Frank's eyebrows rose. "The investigative reporter? That's actually not a terrible idea." Margaret had watched Sarah grow up in the neighborhood, had even tutored her in American history during high school. She'd followed the young woman's career with pride, reading her exposés on political corruption and corporate fraud in the LA Times. Sarah had built a reputation for protecting sources and pursuing difficult truths. She'd know how to handle evidence, how to verify documents without alerting the people we're investigating. Margaret felt hope building for the first time since Morrison's phone call. And she has the resources to reach federal authorities if needed. But can we trust her? Frank's paranoia was showing, the result of decades in security work. Her grandmother lives here. If this story breaks, it could destroy the community she grew up in. It was a valid concern. Sarah's exposures had always targeted distant politicians and faceless corporations, not the neighbors who'd attended her birthday parties and graduation ceremonies. Margaret tried to imagine how she'd react if roles were reversed, if someone approached her with evidence that could devastate everything familiar. "She's a professional," Margaret said, trying to convince herself as much as Frank. "And she spent her career believing that truth matters more than comfort." Another set of headlights appeared on their street, this time from the opposite direction. The same dark sedan, making a return pass. Frank cursed under his breath. "We need to move tonight," he said, "before they decide we're too dangerous to watch from a distance." Margaret's mouth went dry. The implicit threat in his words made their situation impossible to deny or minimize. They'd crossed a line that afternoon, and there was no path back to their safe, boring retirement. "Sarah's probably still awake. She keeps late hours for West Coast deadlines." Margaret moved toward their kitchen phone, then stopped. "But should we call from here? If they're watching—" Frank shook his head. "Nothing over the phone. We need to make contact in person, somewhere public but not obvious." He thought for a moment. The all-night diner on Rosedale Highway. It's far enough from the neighborhood that our going there might seem random. Margaret nodded, her decision crystallizing. They would reach out to Sarah, bring someone with expertise and resources into their dangerous secret. It felt like stepping off a cliff, but the alternative, waiting passively while watched by unknown enemies, seemed worse. The sedan made a third pass. Time was running out to remain ordinary retirees who'd simply bought the wrong storage unit. Margaret stared at the phone for 3 full minutes after Frank suggested the diner, her finger hovering over Sarah's contact number that she'd copied from Mrs. Chen's emergency list months ago. The weight of what they were about to unleash felt enormous, not just on themselves, but on Sarah, whose quiet life would be shattered the moment she learned what her childhood neighborhood had been hiding. "Once we make this call," she said, "we're dragging an innocent person into danger." Frank was methodically checking the contents of his wallet, counting cash and removing credit cards that could be traced. "She's an investigative journalist, Maggie. This is exactly the kind of story that defines a career. We might be giving her the biggest break she'll ever get, or getting her killed." The words came out harsher than Margaret intended, but she couldn't shake the image of Sarah as the earnest teenager who'd spent afternoons at their kitchen table, struggling with essay assignments about World War II. Now Margaret was about to hand her evidence that some of those historical monsters had been living 3 houses down from her grandmother. The sedan appeared again, slower this time, and Margaret watched Frank's jaw tighten as he counted the seconds it remained visible. His security training was calculating patterns, threat levels, response times. The man who'd spent 30 years protecting other people's assets was now trying to figure out how to protect their lives with resources that consisted of $43 in cash, a 15-year-old Honda, and information that powerful people would kill to suppress. "We need to move before they position someone to follow us," he said, pocketing his wallet. "But we also need to assume they already know our vehicle." Margaret felt the familiar frustration that had marked the early years of Frank's retirement, his tendency to identify problems without offering solutions, to catalog risks without suggesting actions. But tonight, that analytical caution might be the only thing keeping them alive. "The Hendersons," she said suddenly. "They're still out back grilling. We could ask to borrow their car, tell them ours won't start, and involve more neighbors?" Frank shook his head. "The fewer people who know our movements tonight, the better." Margaret moved to their bedroom, pulling clothes from their closet with hands that trembled, despite her efforts to stay calm. She'd been dressing for comfort for 3 years now. Elastic waistbands, slip-on shoes, cardigans that didn't require fine motor skills to button. Tonight, she chose her darkest jeans and a navy sweater, clothes that might blend into shadows if needed. The practicality of preparing for potential surveillance felt surreal, like she was playing a role in someone else's life. When she returned to the living room, Frank was studying a local map spread across their coffee table, marking routes to the diner that avoided main thoroughfares. His methodical approach was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it suggested they weren't completely helpless, terrifying because it confirmed they genuinely needed to evade professional surveillance. "We leave separately," he said without looking up. "You take the bus. Route 12 runs until midnight, stops 6 blocks from the diner. I'll drive, take the long way, make sure I'm not followed. And if you are followed?" Frank's pause lasted too long. "Then you call Sarah alone. Tell her everything, give her the storage unit information, and make her promise to involve federal authorities immediately." The casual way he discussed the possibility of being taken or killed made Margaret's chest tight. They'd been married 45 years, had weathered job losses and health scares and family deaths, but they'd never faced anything that required contingency plans for survival. "This is insane," she said, sitting heavily on their couch. "We're 78 and 73 years old, Frank. We take medication for blood pressure and arthritis. Yesterday, our biggest concern was whether we could afford to repair the garbage disposal. Yesterday, we didn't know our mayor might be a Nazi war criminal." Frank folded the map, his movements sharp with suppressed tension. "Yesterday, we didn't know we were living in a community built on lies and murder." Margaret thought about Tom Morrison's voice on the phone, the careful friendliness that hadn't quite masked something harder underneath. She'd known him for 15 years, had voted for him in 4 elections, had sat through countless city council meetings where he'd discussed water treatment plants and parking ordinances with grandfatherly patience. The cognitive dissonance of suspecting him of protecting war criminals felt like her brain was rejecting basic reality. But the vault had been real. The documents had been real. The sense of being watched was real. "Sarah needs to know we might not survive this," Margaret said, forcing herself to articulate what they'd both been thinking. "She needs to understand that if something happens to us, she becomes the only person who knows where the evidence is hidden." Frank met her eyes, and she saw her own fear reflected there, mixed with something that might have been pride. They were terrified, but they were moving forward anyway. It was perhaps the most important thing they'd ever done together. Outside, the sedan made another pass, and this time it stopped. Margaret's breath caught as the sedan's engine went silent. Through the gap in their curtains, she could see it parked directly across the street, nose pointed toward their house like a predator fixing on prey. The driver remained invisible behind tinted glass, but his intention was unmistakable. They were no longer being observed from a distance. "Back door," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. "Now." They moved through their darkened house with the careful steps of burglars in their own home, avoiding the floorboards that creaked, staying below window level. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as they reached the kitchen, where the cheerful yellow walls and ceramic rooster collection seemed to mock the terror that had invaded their lives. Frank peered through the back door's small window, scanning their yard and the alley beyond. Clear. But we go together now, no separate routes. Margaret nodded, abandoning their careful plan. The sight of that motionless sedan had crystallized everything. They weren't paranoid retirees imagining threats. They were witnesses who'd stumbled onto something enormous, and someone was prepared to act against them tonight. They slipped out through their garden gate, moving along the alley that separated their street from the next development. Margaret's knees protested with each hurried step, the arthritis that usually responded to her morning pills now shooting daggers of pain up her legs. Frank's breathing was already labored. His blood pressure medication made exertion difficult, but neither of them slowed. The Rosedale Highway stretched before them like a neon river, its 24-hour businesses creating pools of harsh light in the desert darkness. They'd driven this route hundreds of times, but walking it felt like crossing into foreign territory. Every passing car could contain enemies. Every shadow could hide surveillance. The diner squatted between a tire shop and a payday loan store, its vintage sign flickering Mel's all night in pink and blue neon. Margaret had eaten here exactly twice in 15 years, both times when their power was out and they needed hot food. Now it felt like sanctuary. Frank chose a booth near the back exit, positioning himself to watch the parking lot while Margaret fumbled with her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she misdialed Sarah's number twice before managing to connect. "Mrs. Holloway?" Sarah's voice carried surprise and concern. "It's almost 11. Is everything okay?" Margaret closed her eyes, trying to find words for the impossible. "Sarah, I need you to listen very carefully. Frank and I have discovered something terrible, something dangerous. We need your help as a journalist, but more than that, we need your help to stay alive." The silence on the other end stretched so long, Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice had shifted into professional mode, calm, focused, ready to process information. "Where are you?" "Mel's Diner on Rosedale Highway. We think we're being watched, possibly followed. We found evidence of war criminals living in our community, Nazi war criminals who've been hiding here since the 1940s. Another pause. Margaret could almost hear Sarah's mind working, evaluating whether her former tutor had suffered some kind of mental break. "Mrs. Holloway, that's a very serious accusation. What kind of evidence?" Frank leaned across the table, speaking directly into the phone. "Documents. Thousands of them. Nazi party records, immigration papers, money transfers, addresses. All stored in a bank vault that was hidden in a storage unit. And you think people know you found this?" Margaret watched a police cruiser pull into the diner's parking lot, her pulse spiking until she saw the officer simply ordering coffee through the drive-through window. "Mayor Morrison called us this afternoon. He knew we'd bought that storage unit, knew we'd been inside." The conversation felt threatening. Sarah was quiet for nearly a minute, and Margaret could hear typing in the background. Notes being taken or research being conducted in real time. "I'm driving down tonight," Sarah said finally. "Don't go home. Don't use credit cards. Find somewhere public to wait until I arrive." The relief Margaret felt was so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Someone believed them. Someone with resources and connections was taking their situation seriously. "Sarah, you need to understand, if we're right about this, if these people have successfully hidden for 70 years, they have resources we can't imagine. Coming here could destroy your career, or worse." "Mrs. Holloway." Sarah's voice carried the same steel Margaret remembered from her teenage years, when she'd refused to accept easy answers to complex historical questions. "If you're right about this, it's the biggest story of my lifetime. If you're wrong, you're two scared people who need help from someone who cares about you." Frank met Margaret's eyes across the table, and she saw her own thought reflected there. They'd just crossed the point of no return. Whatever happened next, their quiet retirement was over forever. "Either way," Sarah continued, "I'll be there in 4 hours." Outside, another dark sedan pulled slowly through the parking lot. The dark moment. Margaret's phone went dead in her hand. She stared at the black screen, pressing the power button frantically, but nothing happened. The battery had been at 40% moments before. She'd checked it twice during the call with Sarah. Frank reached for his own phone, his face draining of color as the device remained equally lifeless. "EMP device," he whispered, his security training providing the explanation neither of them wanted to hear. "They're here." Through the diner's plate glass window, Margaret counted 3 dark sedans now positioned around the parking lot, blocking every exit. Men in dark clothing were emerging from the vehicles with the coordinated precision of people who'd done this before. A lot. The elderly waitress behind the counter seemed oblivious, refilling coffee for a trucker who was studying his logbook. The only other customer, a woman in scrubs who'd been picking at pie, looked up from her phone with the same confusion Margaret felt. Her device had died too. "Ma'am?" The diner's front door chimed as a man in an expensive suit entered. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of smile that belonged in campaign photos. "Mrs. Holloway? Mr. Holloway, I'm going to need you to come with us." Margaret's blood turned to ice water. The man's accent was faint but unmistakable, the precise English of someone who'd learned it as a second language, decades ago, German. Her 40 years of teaching history had given her an ear for linguistic patterns, and this one made her stomach lurch. "I think you're mistaken," Frank said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We're just having coffee." The man's smile never wavered as 2 more figures appeared, a woman with sharp cheekbones and cold eyes, and a younger man whose bulk suggested muscle beneath his tailored jacket. The waitress had disappeared into the kitchen. The trucker was gone. Even the woman in scrubs had vanished, leaving behind a half-eaten slice of apple pie and a $5 bill. "Please don't make this more difficult than necessary." The silver-haired man slid into their booth uninvited, his companions blocking any path to the rear exit. "You found something that doesn't belong to you. We'd like it back." Margaret felt Frank's hand find hers under the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in what might be their final moment of contact. 45 years of marriage, and it was ending in a roadside diner while polite monsters discussed their fate. "We don't know what you're talking about," she managed, though her voice cracked on the words. "Mrs. Holloway." The man's tone remained conversational, even friendly. "You were a teacher, yes? American history. Then you understand the importance of preserving order, maintaining stability. Some secrets serve a greater good. Some secrets protect mass murderers," Frank said, his security training finally overriding his fear. "We know what those documents prove. We know who you people really are." The woman with sharp cheekbones leaned forward, and Margaret saw something that made her soul recoil, eyes that held no warmth, no humanity, only the cold calculation of someone who'd made terrible decisions long ago and had never looked back. "You know fragments," the woman said, her accent thicker than her companion's. "You know nothing of the contributions we've made, the communities we've built, the good lives we've led. We are not the same people we were 70 years ago." "Murder doesn't expire," Margaret whispered, finding strength in decades of teaching moral clarity to teenagers. "Evil doesn't become acceptable because time passes." The silver-haired man's smile finally faded. "Mrs. Holloway, your granddaughter lives in Portland, does she not? Works at that lovely children's hospital?" Margaret's world tilted sideways. They knew about Emma, her beautiful, brilliant granddaughter who'd just started her residency in pediatric oncology, who called every Sunday to share stories about her young patients, who trusted that the world was fundamentally good because her grandmother had raised her to believe in justice and truth. "Please," Margaret heard herself saying, the word torn from her throat. "Please don't hurt her. She doesn't know anything about this." "Neither does Mr. Chen's granddaughter," the man continued, his campaign smile returning. "Sarah, isn't it? Driving down from Los Angeles tonight, we understand. Such dangerous highways, so many accidents." Frank's hand tightened on Margaret's, his knuckles white with desperate pressure. They'd brought Sarah into this. Their call for help had painted a target on someone they loved, someone whose only crime had been caring about her former teacher's welfare. "What do you want?" Frank's voice was barely audible. "The location of the storage unit. Any copies you've made of the documents. Your silence." The man stood, straightening his tie with casual precision. In exchange, everyone continues their pleasant, ordinary lives. Outside, Margaret could see more figures moving in the darkness, surrounding the diner like a military operation. How many of them were there? How long had they been organized? How many communities across America housed similar networks of aging monsters who'd traded their bloody past for suburban respectability? "You have until morning to decide," the woman said, sliding a business card across the table. "Call the number. Give us what we need. Or learn how easily good people can disappear when they ask the wrong questions." The three figures moved toward the door with the same coordination they'd shown arriving. At the threshold, the silver-haired man turned back with something that might have been genuine regret. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Holloway, I truly hope you make the sensible choice. This community has been peaceful for so long." Then they were gone, and Margaret and Frank sat alone in the artificial brightness of the all-night diner, surrounded by the detritus of other people's normal lives, abandoned coffee cups, crumpled napkins, the lingering smell of grease and desperation. Their phones remained dead. Sarah was driving toward danger. Emma was sleeping peacefully in Portland, unaware that her grandmother's curiosity had made her a target. Margaret stared at the business card on the table, its simple black text offering a phone number and nothing else. No name, no company, no identification beyond 10 digits that connected to people who'd spent 70 years perfecting the art of making problems disappear. All their careful plans, all their hope for justice, all their faith in doing the right thing, gone. They were two frightened old people facing an enemy with infinite patience and no remaining conscience. For the first time since finding the vault, Margaret understood that they were going to lose. Frank broke the silence first, his voice hollow. "They're not just protecting themselves." Margaret looked up from the business card, seeing her husband's face transformed by a realization that seemed to age him another decade in real time. "What do you mean?" "The coordination, the resources, the way they knew about Emma, about Sarah's route." Frank's security background was finally processing what they'd witnessed. "Margaret, this isn't some desperate group of old Nazis trying to protect their retirement. This is an active organization." The words hung between them like a physical weight. Margaret felt something cold spreading through her chest as the implications crystallized. "You're saying they're still operational, still connected, still serving whatever purpose brought them here in 1947. Frank's hands were trembling now, not with fear, but with the terrible clarity of understanding. "We assumed we'd found evidence of crimes from the past. What if we found evidence of crimes that never stopped?" Margaret's mind raced back through the documents they'd photographed, seeing them now through a different lens. The bank records hadn't just shown money arriving from Europe in the 1940s, they'd shown regular deposits continuing for decades. The correspondence wasn't just between old friends reminiscing, it was between people coordinating activities, sharing information, maintaining networks. "The mayor," she whispered. When he called, he didn't sound like someone protecting ancient secrets. He sounded like someone protecting current operations. Frank nodded grimly. "And the woman tonight, did you see her eyes? Those weren't the eyes of some reformed grandmother living quietly in suburbia. Those were the eyes of someone still capable of giving orders that destroy lives." The revelation crashed over Margaret like a physical blow. For 70 years, she'd taught her students about the Holocaust as history, a terrible chapter that humanity had learned from and moved beyond. She'd raised her own children and grandchildren to believe that good ultimately triumphed over evil, that justice might be delayed but would eventually prevail. But what if the evil had never been defeated? What if it had simply relocated, adapted, learned to wear the mask of respectability while continuing its work in subtler forms? Frank, what if this whole community, what if Bakersfield itself, wasn't just a hiding place? What if it was a base of operations? Her husband's face went ashen as the same thought struck him. Think about it. The location. Close enough to Los Angeles for access to ports, banking, international connections. Far enough away to avoid scrutiny. Desert climate, perfect for long-term document storage, minimal degradation. Margaret felt her understanding of their entire life together. shifting like sand beneath her feet. 15 years they'd lived here. 15 years of voting for Tom Morrison, shopping at businesses that might be fronts, befriending neighbors who might be living under assumed identities. How many pleasant conversations had they shared with monsters? How many community barbecues had they attended with war criminals? The network we exposed tonight, Frank continued, his voice gaining strength as his analytical mind engaged fully. The way they moved, communicated, coordinated. That's not just about protecting old men from prosecution. That's about protecting current infrastructure. Infrastructure for what? Frank met her eyes, and Margaret saw her own horror reflected there. I don't know. Money laundering, human trafficking, arms dealing? With 70 years to establish themselves, integrate into legitimate businesses, build relationships with local officials. He trailed off, the possibilities too vast and terrible to enumerate. Margaret thought about Emma, innocent and trusting, dedicating her life to healing children. She thought about Sarah, driving through the darkness to help them, believing she was pursuing a story about historical justice. Neither of them understood they weren't just threatening to expose the past. They were threatening to expose something that was still alive, still growing, still dangerous. We can't call that number, Margaret said suddenly, her voice carrying a steel that surprised them both. Margaret, they have our granddaughter. She stood up, her arthritis forgotten, her fear transformed into something harder. They threatened our granddaughter. They're threatening Sarah. But Frank, if we're right, if this is bigger than we imagined, then giving them what they want doesn't guarantee anyone's safety. It just makes us complicit. Frank stared at her, seeing something in his wife's face he'd never witnessed before. The gentle teacher who'd spent 4 decades nurturing young minds had become something fiercer, forged by the terrible understanding that evil wasn't always punished, justice wasn't always served, and sometimes good people had to make impossible choices. Then what do we do? Margaret picked up the business card, staring at those 10 digits that connected to decades of hidden crimes. For the first time since the confrontation began, she smiled, not with warmth, but with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd finally found clarity in chaos. We changed the game, she said. They think we're frightened old people who stumbled onto something we can't handle. They think they can threaten us into compliance because we don't understand what we're really fighting. She tore the business card in half. They're wrong. Frank stared at the torn pieces of the business card scattered on the diner table, his wife's decisive action reverberating through him like a shockwave. In 45 years of marriage, he'd seen Margaret angry, frustrated, even furious, but never like this. Never with the cold, calculated fury of someone who'd finally glimpsed the true scope of evil and refused to bow to it. Margaret, what you're suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet. She gathered the torn card pieces, methodically shredding them into smaller fragments. I'm thinking, something I should have done more of before we made that phone call to Sarah. Frank watched his wife transform before his eyes. The trembling fear that had consumed her moments before was burning away, replaced by the same analytical intensity she'd brought to decades of lesson planning. But this wasn't about teaching teenagers the causes of World War I. This was about outsmarting an organization that had successfully hidden in plain sight for 7 decades. First, Margaret said, pulling a napkin toward her and beginning to write with a pen from her purse, we inventory what we actually know versus what we suspect. The simple act of making a list seemed to steady them both. Frank found himself leaning forward, his own military training reasserting itself. They were no longer victims waiting for salvation. They were operatives planning a mission. Facts, Margaret wrote at the top of the napkin. The storage unit contained Nazi documents, immigration records, and financial transfers dating from 1947 to present day. Mayor Morrison called us within hours of our discovery. The people who confronted us tonight demonstrated professional-level coordination and surveillance capabilities. Add this, Frank said, his voice gaining strength. They knew about Emma's hospital, Sarah's route, and enough personal details to suggest either extensive surveillance or access to databases that should be restricted. Margaret nodded, continuing her list. Assumptions: this is an active network, not just aging war criminals. They have local connections, possibly including law enforcement or government officials. They consider us a significant enough threat to risk exposure through direct confrontation. The waitress reappeared from the kitchen, approaching their table with obvious nervousness. Folks? I'm sorry, but we're going to be closing early tonight. Manager's orders. Margaret looked up at the woman, barely 25, with tired eyes and the kind of polyester uniform that spoke of paycheck-to-paycheck survival. How long have you worked here? About 6 months. Look, I don't want any trouble. Neither do we, Frank said gently. But I think you might have saved our lives tonight by going to the kitchen when you did. The waitress glanced nervously toward the windows, where the parking lot remained empty except for their ancient Honda. Those people who were here, they weren't exactly subtle about wanting everyone gone. Gave my manager $200 cash to close up and disappear for the rest of the night. Margaret and Frank exchanged glances. Even the cleanup was professional, methodical. What's your name? Margaret asked. Jenny. Jenny, if anyone asks about tonight, and they might, you never saw us. We were never here. Can you do that? The young woman nodded quickly, already planning on it. Look, I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but those people felt like the kind you don't cross. After Jenny hurried away, Frank turned back to Margaret's growing list. So where does this leave us? We can't go home, we can't contact Sarah. For all we know, they're monitoring her too. We can't go to local police. But we're not completely powerless, Margaret said, her teacher's mind working through the problem like a complex historical puzzle. They made a mistake tonight. What mistake? They showed themselves. For 70 years, their greatest asset has been invisibility. Tonight, they revealed resources, methods, personnel. They broke their own operational security because they perceived us as an immediate threat. Frank felt a spark of his old analytical skills rekindling. You're right. If they could have handled this quietly, made us disappear, discredited us, arranged an accident, they would have. The fact that they approached us directly suggests desperation. Or arrogance. Margaret's pen moved across the napkin again. They've been untouchable for so long, maybe they've forgotten how to be truly careful. But we still have the same problems. No safe place to go, no way to contact help without endangering people we care about. Margaret smiled, and this time it carried genuine warmth alongside the steel. Frank, what's the one advantage every teacher has when facing a classroom full of teenagers who think they're smarter than the adult in the room? He stared at her, missing the connection. Experience, she continued. Not with their specific tactics, but with human nature, with patience, with finding the weakness in seemingly unbeatable opponents. She folded the napkin and tucked it into her purse. They think they know us, frightened retirees who stumbled onto something beyond our comprehension. But they're wrong about something fundamental. What's that? Margaret stood, shouldering her purse with renewed purpose. I've spent 40 years teaching children how ordinary people stood up to evil throughout history. Tonight, it's time for a practical application. For the first time since the vault opened, Frank felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. Frank followed Margaret out of the diner into the desert night, feeling the weight of their decision settle around them like armor. The parking lot stretched empty under flickering streetlights, their Honda sitting alone like a faithful dog waiting for its owners. But as they approached the car, Margaret suddenly stopped. Wait! She grabbed Frank's arm, her grip tight with realization. They let us leave. Frank paused, his hand on the door handle. What do you mean? Think about it. They had us surrounded, Frank. You saw the figures moving outside. They could have taken us anywhere, done anything they wanted. Margaret's voice carried the electric intensity of a breakthrough. But they let us walk out of there. Why? The question hung in the cooling air as Frank's security training kicked in. Because they want us mobile. They want us to lead them somewhere. Or to someone. Margaret's eyes widened as the full implication hit her. Frank, they don't just want the documents, they want our network. They want to know who else we might have contacted, what other copies might exist, who else might be asking questions. Frank felt ice forming in his stomach. They're using us as bait. Which means our car? Margaret stepped back from the Honda, as if it had suddenly become venomous. They've had hours to do whatever they wanted to it. Tracking devices, at minimum. They stood in the harsh fluorescent glow of the parking lot. Two elderly people suddenly understanding that every step forward was a choice between terrible options. Going home meant walking into a trap. Staying meant eventually being collected like chess pieces. Running meant abandoning Emma and Sarah to face consequences they couldn't predict. But Margaret's transformation from the diner held. If anything, the new revelation seemed to sharpen her resolve. They made another mistake, she said quietly. What? They assumed we'd think like victims, that we'd panic, make desperate choices, lead them to everything they want to destroy. Margaret pulled out her phone, its screen still dark and useless. But Frank, what if we don't run from the trap? What if we spring it deliberately? Frank stared at his wife, recognizing the look on her face from parent-teacher conferences where she'd systematically dismantled the arguments of overconfident bullies. You want to use ourselves as bait. I want to force them into the open. Tonight proved they can operate in shadows, control information, make people disappear quietly. But what happens when they can't hide anymore? What happens when their 70-year-old secret becomes public knowledge they can't suppress? Frank's mind began working through the implications. They lose everything. Not just freedom from prosecution, their entire infrastructure collapses. Money, influence, operational capacity. Exactly. So we give them what they think they want. A panic chase to recover evidence and silence witnesses. But we control the terms. Margaret began walking toward the car again, but slowly, deliberately. They want to follow us? Perfect. We'll lead them somewhere. They can't disappear us quietly. Where? Margaret's smile carried echoes of 40 years' worth of teenagers who'd underestimated her strategic thinking. Frank, what's the one place in any community where secrets become impossible to keep? Where information spreads faster than anyone can contain it? Where ordinary people gather in large numbers and pay attention to unusual activity? Frank felt his own smile beginning as he understood. Schools. Bakersfield High opens at 6 a.m. for maintenance staff and early athletics. In 3 hours, the parking lot will start filling with teachers, coaches, and students who arrive early for zero-period classes. Margaret reached for the car door handle, her movements calm and purposeful. By 8 a.m., there will be over 2,000 people on that campus, most of them with smartphones and social media accounts. They can't make 2,000 witnesses disappear, Frank breathed. And I know every inch of that school. 40 years of teaching there means I know every entrance, exit, hiding place, and security camera. I know which teachers arrive early, which administrators can be trusted, which students are always filming everything for their TikTok accounts. Frank felt the last of his despair burning away, replaced by something he hadn't experienced since his military days, the fierce joy of having a mission worth completing. But Margaret, if we're wrong, if they're willing to risk exposure for mass casualties, then we'll have forced them to show the world exactly what they are. Margaret opened her door, pausing to look at him across the roof of their car. Frank, we're 70 years old. How many more years do we have? 10? 15? But Emma has her whole life ahead of her. Sarah, all those students I taught, all the children they'll raise, they deserve a world where this kind of evil can't hide in plain sight. Frank climbed into the passenger seat, feeling the weight of their choice settle around him like destiny. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of headlights flickering to life in the distance. Margaret started the engine, her hands steady on the wheel. Ready for one last lesson plan, Frank? He reached over and squeezed her hand. Let's teach them something they'll never forget. The Honda's engine hummed quietly as Margaret guided them through Bakersfield's empty streets, taking the long route toward the high school, while Frank monitored the side mirror. The headlights he'd spotted outside the diner maintained a careful distance, close enough to track, far enough to avoid detection by anyone less paranoid than a former security consultant. 2 vehicles, Frank murmured, watching the choreographed dance of surveillance. They're switching positions every few blocks, professional rotation. Margaret felt a grim satisfaction at the confirmation. After decades of teaching teenagers who thought they could outsmart her, She recognized the telltale signs of overconfidence. Good. Let them think they're hunting us. The familiar streets of their adopted hometown look different now. Every shadow potentially hiding watchers, every intersection a possible trap. Margaret found herself cataloging details with the same intensity she'd once applied to lesson planning, which businesses had security cameras, where the nearest police station sat, how quickly emergency services could respond to the school. But beneath the tactical thinking, a deeper current of memory flowed. 40 years of arriving at Bakersfield high before dawn, of unlocking her classroom while the custodians finished their rounds and the first eager students gathered in the hallway. Thousands of faces had passed through her world history classes, children who'd grown into doctors, teachers, mechanics, parents. She'd taught them about the Holocaust not as abstract horror, but as a warning about what happened when good people remained silent. Tonight, she was about to test whether her own lessons had taken root. "Frank, in my purse, there's a small address book. Find the entry for Bill Martinez." Frank fumbled through her belongings, finding the worn notebook filled with Margaret's careful handwriting. The principal? Former student, class of 1987. Lost his father in Desert Storm, raised by his grandmother, earned a scholarship to UC Davis. Margaret's voice carried the pride of a teacher watching seeds bloom decades later. "If anyone will understand what we're trying to do, it's Bill." She pulled into a 24-hour gas station 6 blocks from the school, parking under harsh fluorescent lights that would make them visible from any angle. The pursuing vehicles slowed, taking positions at the edges of the lot's illumination. Margaret counted silhouettes, at least 6 people, probably more in reserve. "They're not even trying to hide anymore," Frank observed, "because they think they have us cornered." Margaret dialed Bill Martinez's number, praying he still kept the same early hours she remembered from his student days. The phone rang twice before a sleep-rough voice answered. "Margaret? Jesus, it's 3 in the morning. Are you—" "Bill, I need you to listen very carefully. In about 30 minutes I'm going to arrive at school. There will be people following me, dangerous people who want to prevent me from telling a story that needs to be heard." She spoke with the calm authority that had commanded attention in hundreds of classroom emergencies. "I need you to trust me the way you did when you were 17 and thought the world was ending because Jennifer Morrison wouldn't go to prom with you." A pause. Then Bill's voice, fully alert now. "What kind of story?" "The kind that explains why your school sits on land donated by the Morrison Foundation in 1962. The kind that explains why certain families in this town have such interesting immigration stories." Margaret watched the shadows shifting around the gas station's perimeter. "I'm going to need witnesses, Bill. Lots of them. And cameras." Another pause, longer this time. When Bill spoke again, his voice carried the steel that had made him effective at managing a school full of teenagers. "Margaret, you taught me that history doesn't end when the bell rings, that the past stays alive until somebody forces it into the light." "Yes. How long do I have?" 30 minutes. "Can you make some calls?" "I can do better than that. Wrestling team has practice at 5:30. Academic decathlon meets at 6. I'll activate the emergency notification system. Tell everyone we're having an unscheduled safety drill." Bill's voice gained energy as he shifted into crisis management mode. "By the time you arrive, this place will be crawling with people who owe you more than they could ever repay." Margaret felt tears threatening for the first time since the confrontation began. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that 4 decades of teaching had created something stronger than any conspiracy. An invisible network of trust, respect, and shared values that spanned generations. "One more thing," she said. "Call Channel 8. Tell them Sarah Chen has a story breaking at the school in 1 hour. Tell them to bring everything." After ending the call, Margaret looked at Frank, seeing her own mixture of terror and determination reflected in his weathered features. Around them, the shadows continued to move with predatory patience. "Last chance to change our minds," Frank said quietly. Margaret started the engine, pulling slowly out of the gas station as their hunters fell into formation behind them. "Frank, 40 years ago, I promised a classroom full of kids that good people would never again stand by and let evil flourish in darkness." She turned toward Bakersfield High, where the first lights were beginning to flicker on in the administrative building. Time to keep that promise. The Honda's headlights swept across the familiar entrance of Bakersfield High as Margaret turned into the parking lot, her hands steady despite the convoy of shadows following behind them. The school's administrative building glowed against the pre-dawn darkness, windows blazing with activity that shouldn't exist at 4 in the morning. "Bill kept his word," Frank murmured, watching figures moving purposefully through the hallways visible from the parking lot. Margaret parked directly under the main entrance's floodlights, making them impossible to miss. Behind them, their pursuers hesitated at the lot's perimeter. 6 vehicles now, she counted, their occupants undoubtedly recalculating strategies as they realized their prey had led them into an illuminated fishbowl. The Honda's doors slammed shut with finality as Margaret and Frank stepped into the harsh white light. Around the parking lot's edges, she could see the hunters emerging from their vehicles, men in dark clothing who moved with military precision, their faces grim masks of professional irritation. "Mrs. Holloway!" Bill Martinez's voice echoed across the asphalt as he jogged toward them from the main building, flanked by 2 teachers Margaret recognized and 3 students in wrestling gear. "Right on time for our emergency drill." The lead pursuer, the man from the diner, she realized, stepped forward into the light, his hand moving inside his jacket, but he froze as more figures appeared around the school's perimeter. The wrestling coach emerged from the gymnasium with a dozen muscular teenagers. 3 members of the academic decathlon team materialized near the library entrance, smartphones already recording. A news van rounded the corner onto the school's main drive, Channel 8's logo bright under the streetlights. "Federal agents!" the man shouted, producing credentials that gleamed under the floods. "This is official business. Clear the area immediately." Bill Martinez stepped between the agent and Margaret, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to diffusing teenage drama. "Sir, this is school property. If you have official business here, you'll need to coordinate through district administration and provide proper warrants." More vehicles were arriving now, teachers who'd responded to Bill's emergency calls, early arriving students whose parents had dropped them off for zero-period classes, and a second news van from a competing station. Margaret felt the mathematical equation shifting in real time. Too many witnesses, too many cameras, too much light and noise for a quiet resolution. The lead agent's face contorted with frustrated rage. "That woman is in possession of classified materials vital to national security. Stand aside." "Then I'm sure you won't mind waiting for proper legal procedures," called a new voice. Margaret turned to see Sarah Chen climbing out of a Channel 8 news van, her camera operator already filming. Federal agents should have documentation, chain of custody procedures, backup from local law enforcement. The agent's hand moved toward his weapon again, but he caught himself as he realized the camera was broadcasting live. Around the parking lot, at least 30 people now watched the confrontation, many with their own recording devices. Margaret stepped forward, feeling the weight of 40 years' worth of moral authority settling on her shoulders like academic robes. When she spoke, her voice carried across the asphalt with the clarity that had commanded attention in countless classrooms. "I am Margaret Holloway. For 4 decades, I taught the children of this community about the importance of confronting evil, even when that evil wears the mask of respectability." She reached into her purse, withdrawing a folder thick with photocopied documents. 3 days ago, my husband and I discovered evidence of a conspiracy that has hidden in this community for 70 years. Evidence of war criminals who escaped justice and built new lives as pillars of society. "Mrs. Holloway, stop!" The agent lunged forward, but found his path blocked by a wall of teenagers and teachers who had unconsciously formed a protective circle around their former educator. "These documents detail Operation Paperclip Connections, Nazi gold transfers, and the systematic relocation of SS officers into American suburban communities," Margaret continued, her voice rising with the passion that had made her legendary in the classroom. "They contain names, addresses, financial records, and evidence of ongoing operations designed to protect war criminals and their descendants." The agent drew his weapon, prompting screams from the watching crowd, but the movement was captured by a dozen cameras streaming live to social media platforms. Frank stepped beside his wife, his own voice carrying the calm professionalism of his security background. The original documents are already in secure locations. Copies have been distributed to multiple news organizations and historical archives. This conspiracy's greatest weapon, secrecy, is already broken. Margaret looked directly into Sarah's camera, speaking to an audience far beyond the parking lot. My students, you asked me once why ordinary people stayed silent during history's darkest moments. Tonight, we choose not to be silent. The agent's hand trembled as he faced an impossible calculation: pull the trigger and create martyrs on live television, or watch 70 years of carefully constructed lies crumble under the weight of smartphones and social media. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Real police, responding to reports of weapons drawn at the high school. Margaret smiled, recognizing the sound of justice finally arriving. The agent's weapon remained trained on Margaret as the sirens grew louder, his face a mask of desperate calculation. Around the parking lot, the crowd had swollen to nearly 100 people. Teachers, students, parents, and neighbors drawn by the emergency notifications and social media posts spreading like wildfire through Bakersfield's networks. Margaret felt the weight of the moment settling over her like snow. Victory was within reach. The truth would emerge, the conspiracy would crumble, justice would finally arrive. But as she watched the agent's finger tighten on the trigger, she understood with crystalline clarity what victory would cost. "Frank," she whispered, never taking her eyes off the weapon pointed at her heart, "I need you to step away, like hell." Her husband moved closer, his body deliberately blocking part of the agent's line of sight. "Please." Margaret's voice carried the gentle firmness she'd used with particularly stubborn students. "This story needs to be told by someone who lived to see it through." The truth hung between them, unspoken but understood. The agent was trapped, unable to retreat, unwilling to create a massacre on live television, but too desperate to simply surrender. Men like this, Margaret had learned from decades of studying history's darkest chapters, became most dangerous when cornered. They would take whatever final victory they could grasp. Frank's hand found hers, squeezing tight. 47 years of marriage, and you still think you can give me homework assignments. Despite everything, Margaret almost smiled. Consider it extra credit. Sarah Chen's voice cut through the tension, her reporter's instincts recognizing the critical moment. "Mrs. Holloway, can you tell us about the Morrison Foundation? The documents you mentioned earlier?" Margaret understood. The young reporter was giving her one last chance to speak, to ensure the most damning revelations reached the public record before bullets could silence them forever. Around the parking lot, dozens of cameras focused on her face, smartphones, news equipment, security feeds, creating an audience that stretched far beyond this moment. The Morrison family arrived in Bakersfield in 1947, Margaret began, her teacher's voice carrying clearly across the asphalt. Heinrich Müller died in that same year, according to the documents we found. Same age, same physical description, and the Morrison Foundation's initial funding came from Swiss accounts linked to Nazi gold transfers. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret saw Bill Martinez's face pale as he processed the implications. The school he dedicated his career to serving, built on land purchased with blood money. Mayor Patricia Morrison is Muller's granddaughter, Margaret continued, feeling each word like a nail in her own coffin. The documents detail payments made to protect the family identity, ongoing operations to discredit any investigation, and connections to at least 12 other relocated war criminals still living in California communities. The agent's weapon never wavered, but Margaret could see the defeat in his eyes. Too much information had already escaped, spread too far across too many platforms to contain. The secret that had survived 70 years was dying in real time, broadcast to thousands of viewers who would carry the truth forward whether she lived or not. "Mrs. Holloway," a new voice, young and urgent. Emma Chen pushed through the crowd, her face streaked with tears and determination. "The boxes from the storage unit, we uploaded everything to the cloud before they took us. It's already going viral." Margaret's heart clenched as she realized Emma had doomed herself along with them. The girl's bravery had ensured the evidence would survive, but it had also made her a target another innocent drawn into the crossfire of secrets that should have died decades ago. "Emma, no," Sarah breathed, understanding the same terrible arithmetic. The agent's radio crackled with urgent voices, other members of his team reporting the scope of the information leak, the impossibility of containment, the complete failure of their 70-year mission. His face hardened with the cold mathematics of damage control. If he couldn't save the conspiracy, he could at least eliminate the primary sources. Margaret stepped forward deliberately, drawing the weapon's focus entirely onto herself. "Frank, take Emma and get back. This is my responsibility." "The hell it is." Frank moved beside her instead, his security training evident in how he positioned his body. "We opened that vault together. We finished this together." The parking lot had gone silent except for the approaching sirens and the soft whir of camera motors. Margaret looked out at the faces surrounding them, former students, colleagues, neighbors, and saw her life's work reflected in their expressions. Not fear, but resolve. Not confusion, but understanding. 40 years of teaching about moral courage had prepared them for this moment. Mrs. Holloway called one of her former students, now a teacher herself. "We've got your back." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks as she realized the final lesson she would teach. Sometimes victory required everything, not just courage or sacrifice, but the willingness to trust that the seeds you'd planted would grow long after you were gone. The agent raised his weapon higher as the first police car rounded the corner, its lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. The weapon's muzzle flash never came. Margaret watched in stunned silence as the agent's arm dropped to his side, his face collapsing into exhausted defeat. Around them, the parking lot erupted with the sounds of arriving police vehicles, their sirens wailing against the pre-dawn darkness. The mathematical equation had finally tipped beyond recovery. Too many witnesses, too many cameras, too much evidence already spreading through digital networks for violence to serve any purpose. Weapons on the ground, hands visible. The Bakersfield police had arrived in force, officers emerging from multiple vehicles with practiced efficiency. The agent and his remaining team members complied with mechanical precision, their faces blank masks of professional failure. Margaret's legs nearly buckled as the adrenaline drained from her system. Frank caught her arm, his own hands trembling as he guided her toward one of the concrete planters near the school's entrance. Around them, the crowd maintained a respectful distance while Sarah Chen's camera continued rolling, documenting the conspiracy's final moments. "It's over," Frank whispered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and disbelief. 70 years, and it ends in a high school parking lot. Emma appeared beside them, her young face streaked with tears and something that might have been relief. "The upload's finished an hour ago. Everything's already on WikiLeaks, sent to the Times, the Post, the Journal, even if they—" She gestured toward the agents being handcuffed near the police cars. "The truth's out there now." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She watched her former students and colleagues milling around the parking lot, their faces reflecting the same mixture of shock and vindication she felt burning in her chest. Bill Martinez approached hesitantly, his expression caught between pride and profound sadness. "The Morrison family," he said quietly. "Patricia called an emergency city council meeting 20 minutes ago. Word is she's resigning, effective immediately. Her entire family's disappeared. Neighbors say they packed up and left town around midnight." The information hit Margaret like a physical blow. Whatever satisfaction she'd expected from exposing the truth was tempered by the realization of what she'd destroyed. Patricia Morrison, Heinrich Muller's granddaughter, had been a friend, a colleague, someone she'd worked with on countless community projects. The woman who'd helped fund the new library wing, who'd organized disaster relief after the earthquake, who'd been nothing but kind and generous for the 30 years Margaret had known her. "Was I right?" Margaret asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. All these people living normal lives, raising families, contributing to their communities. Was destroying that worth it? Frank's weathered hand found hers, squeezing tight. They built those lives on stolen ground, with stolen gold, under stolen names. The families of their victims never got the chance to live normal lives. Sarah Chen knelt beside Margaret's makeshift seat on the planter's edge, her reporter's instincts balanced against genuine compassion. "Mrs. Holloway, what happens next? There will be investigations, trials, probably congressional hearings. Are you prepared for what's coming?" Margaret looked around the parking lot, seeing it transform before her eyes. The school where she'd taught for 4 decades would become a focal point for national media attention. Every family in Bakersfield with European immigration stories would face scrutiny. The community she'd spent her life serving would be forever changed by what she'd chosen to reveal. "I've spent 40 years teaching students that the truth matters more than comfort," she said finally. "That justice delayed isn't justice denied if someone finally has the courage to demand it. I suppose I'll find out if I really believed what I was saying." Detective Rodriguez from the Bakersfield police approached, notebook in hand and exhaustion written across her features. "Mrs. Holloway, we're going to need comprehensive statements from you and your husband. The FBI is already en route to take over the federal aspects of this case. It's going to be a long process." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of the coming months settling on her shoulders. Depositions, hearings, testimony, media interviews. The quiet retirement she and Frank had planned was gone forever, replaced by something far more complicated and demanding. But as she looked around the parking lot one final time, seeing the faces of former students who'd chosen to stand with her against armed federal agents, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the profound satisfaction of a lesson successfully taught. Not about history or literature or critical thinking, but about the fundamental human obligation to choose justice over comfort, truth over peace. The sun was beginning to rise over Bakersfield, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded Margaret of the optimism she'd tried to instill in thousands of students over the decades. The conspiracy was broken, the secrets exposed, the long-delayed reckoning finally at hand. It would have to be enough. The return. 6 months later, Margaret stood in her kitchen making coffee for two, watching the morning sun stream through windows that no longer felt quite like home. The house hadn't changed. Same faded wallpaper, same creaking floorboards, same view of the neighbor's overgrown oleander hedge, but she moved through the familiar spaces like a visitor in her own life. The coffee maker gurgled to completion as Frank shuffled in, moving more slowly than he had before the endless depositions and congressional hearings had worn them both thin. His hair had gone completely white during the media circus, and new lines mapped the terrain around, his eyes like geological surveys of exhaustion. "Channel 8 wants another interview," he said, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "Something about the Morrison family's arrest in Argentina." Margaret poured coffee into matching mugs they'd owned for 20 years, steam rising between them like incense. "I'm done with interviews. Sarah Chen got the exclusive she deserved. The rest can write their stories without us." Through the window, she could see Mrs. Patterson from next door tending her roses with determined concentration, pointedly avoiding eye contact. Half the neighborhood had stopped speaking to them after the revelations began. The other half treated them like celebrities, which somehow felt worse. Margaret had become a symbol, justice seeker, truth teller, destroyer of comfortable lies, when all she'd wanted was to supplement their retirement fund with some antique furniture. The doorbell rang, its familiar two-note chime cutting through the kitchen's quiet. Frank started to rise, but Margaret waved him back. "I'll get it." Emma Chen stood on the front porch, looking older than her 19 years should have allowed. The young woman who'd helped expose the conspiracy had become something of a folk hero among her generation, invited to speak at universities about the moral obligations of digital natives. But standing in Margaret's doorway, she looked like what she'd always been, a frightened girl trying to do the right thing. "I brought something," Emma said, holding up a manila envelope thick with papers. "The final FBI report. Thought you'd want to see it before the media gets hold of it." Margaret led her into the living room, where cardboard boxes still lined the walls. Evidence files, legal documents, correspondence from historians and journalists around the world. Their quiet retirement had become a makeshift archive of international war crimes research. Emma settled onto the couch where Margaret had graded 10,000 essays over the years. They found 12 families total. Some of the children and grandchildren had no idea about their family histories. Others— She paused, consulting her notes with the precision Margaret remembered from AP history class. Others were actively involved in maintaining the conspiracy. Financial networks, identity protection, even some intimidation operations. Margaret sank into Frank's recliner, feeling the weight of other people's secrets pressing against her chest. How many innocent people did we destroy, Emma? How many innocent people did we save? Emma countered, her voice carrying an edge Margaret hadn't heard before. The Morrison Foundation funded 3 schools and a hospital using Nazi gold. Every scholarship they gave, every charity event they organized, all of it built on stolen money from murdered families. Frank appeared in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, listening. Margaret looked at her husband and saw the same question that haunted her own reflection. Had they done the right thing, or had they simply chosen one form of injustice over another? Patricia Morrison's grandmother was 12 when her family was murdered in Poland, Emma continued. Her real name was Rebecca Kowalski. The Morrison Foundation's initial endowment was literally her inheritance, stolen by Heinrich Müller and laundered through Swiss banks for 30 years. The information hit Margaret like a physical blow. Patricia Morrison, the woman she'd destroyed, the family friend who'd fled the country in disgrace, had unknowingly spent her life giving away the very money stolen from Holocaust victims. The moral arithmetic was staggering in its complexity. The Kowalski family has survivors, Emma said softly. Cousins in Israel, a nephew in New York. They're filing claims to recover the foundation assets. It's going to take years, but they'll finally get their family's money back. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling something shift inside her chest. The weight wasn't disappearing. She would carry the consequences of her choices for whatever years remained. But alongside the guilt and uncertainty, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: the profound satisfaction of problems solved, wrongs addressed, justice served across impossible decades. Mrs. Holloway? Emma's voice carried the same tentative respect it had held during class discussions years ago. I'm starting graduate school in the fall. Holocaust studies. I wanted to thank you for teaching me that some truths are worth the cost of learning them. Margaret opened her eyes and saw her student, her former student, she corrected herself, transformed by the same moral clarity that had shaped Margaret's own teaching career. The young woman who'd risked everything to expose a conspiracy had become exactly what Margaret had spent 40 years trying to create, a person who chose justice over comfort, truth over peace. It would have to be enough. The new beginning. 3 years later, Margaret sat in the garden behind their new apartment, watching hummingbirds dart between the salvias she'd planted in terracotta pots. The small space felt nothing like the house they'd sold. No room for Frank's workshop, no extra bedrooms for visiting family who'd stopped visiting, but the morning light fell across her hands the same way it always had, warm and forgiving. The move to the coast had been Frank's idea. Too many ghosts in Bakersfield, he'd said after the 3rd death threat arrived in their mailbox. Margaret hadn't argued. The town where she'd spent 4 decades teaching had become a monument to uncomfortable truths. Every familiar street corner a reminder of lives disrupted and secrets destroyed. Frank emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of tea, moving with the careful precision of a man whose arthritis had worsened under the stress of congressional testimony and federal depositions. His hands shook slightly as he settled into the chair beside her, but his eyes held a clarity she hadn't seen since before they'd opened that damned vault. Emma called, he said, offering her the steaming mug. She's defending her dissertation next month. Operation Bernhard and Post-War Identity Networks in American Communities. Wants us to come to Princeton for the ceremony. Margaret accepted the tea, inhaling the familiar bergamot scent that had become their new morning ritual. Earl Grey instead of coffee, small concessions to aging bodies that had endured more than they'd bargained for. I'd like that. See what our little whistleblower has become. Through the garden's chain-link fence, she could see the elementary school where she'd volunteered for the past year, reading to 2nd graders who had no idea their story lady had once been on the front page of the New York Times. The work felt different than teaching high school, simpler, purer, untainted by the moral complexities that had consumed her later career. These children just wanted to hear about curious monkeys and runaway bunnies, stories where right and wrong occupied clearly defined territories. The Kowalski settlement was finalized, Frank continued, consulting his phone with the awkward deliberation of someone still learning to navigate technology. $14 million recovered from Morrison Foundation assets. The nephew in New York is establishing a Holocaust education fund. Margaret nodded, feeling the familiar mix of satisfaction and sorrow that accompanied every update from their old life. Justice served, wounds acknowledged, but at the cost of a community's innocence. She wondered sometimes if the 12-year-old Polish girl, named Rebecca Kowalski, would have wanted her stolen inheritance to destroy the American family that had unknowingly carried her name for 70 years. A red-winged blackbird landed on the fence post, cocking its head to study the two old people sitting quietly in their small garden. Margaret remembered teaching a lesson about moral courage years ago, using the metaphor of birds, how they sing not because they know they're safe, but because they must sing regardless of the danger. She hadn't understood then that she was describing her own future. "Do you regret it?" she asked Frank, the question emerging from months of contemplation. "All of it. The vault, the exposure, everything we gave up." Frank was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 3 years examining the same impossible equation. "I regret that it was necessary," he said. "I regret that we lived next door to stolen names and bloody money for 30 years without knowing. I regret that children and grandchildren had to pay for their ancestors' crimes. But I don't regret opening that vault. Some doors can't be closed once you've seen what's behind them." Margaret reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the practiced ease of a marriage that had survived congressional hearings, death threats, and the complete upheaval of everything they'd thought they knew about their community. His wedding ring was loose now. They'd both lost weight during the ordeal, but it caught the morning light the same way it had 50 years ago. A text message chimed on her phone. Sarah Chen, now a correspondent for CNN, sending updates from the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, where Heinrich Muller's surviving co-conspirators were finally facing justice. The reporter who'd risked everything to broadcast their story had built a Pulitzer Prize-winning career on the foundation of one extraordinary night in a high school parking lot. Margaret deleted the message without reading it completely. She was done being a symbol, finished carrying other people's moral burdens. The truth had been told, the consequences absorbed, the long-delayed reckoning completed. What happened next belonged to younger hands, stronger backs, hearts not yet worn thin by the weight of impossible choices. The hummingbird returned, hovering near the red blooms Margaret had planted specifically to attract them. Such small creatures, she mused, but they migrated thousands of miles each year, following ancient routes that demanded everything they had. Sometimes survival required abandoning the familiar, embracing transformation even when the destination remained uncertain. The garden was enough. The morning light was enough. Frank's weathered hand in hers was enough. The rest belonged to history now, where it had always belonged.